Right into our next panel, which is our first panel, the Once and Future Promise of Technology, moderated by the Director of Silicon Flatirons Privacy Center, Margot Kaminsky.
Thank you, Connor. So thank you again to Amy, to Vanessa, and to Heather for organizing a fantastic event. I have been tasked with staying on schedule, which all of you will note gives us an hour instead of an hour and 15 minutes for this panel. So I'm going to keep it very short. We are today's optimists. That said, I imagine some nuance is going to emerge in the course of conversation. In the interest of time, I am not going to introduce each of our panelists. I highly encourage you, though, to look them up online in that incredible access to information that Representative Neguse pointed out we now all have. They're truly, truly an impressive bunch, and I feel honored to lead this discussion. So I'll kick it off with a question to Dr. Newton Campbell, who's sitting immediately to my left. In this age of otherwise techno-pessimism, how do we remain productively excited about what's to come, and what soon-to-come technological development makes you, in particular, most excited?
Okay, so I can sort of answer both of those questions at the same time. So as an applied scientist, I'm committed to the idea that we can take scientific knowledge and apply it to problems that are occurring within our social spheres at an individual level in ways that benefit humanity or benefit the individual. And technology fundamentally is the realization of that idea. And in this techno-pessimistic environment, what I often find is that we tend to look at some of the short-term phenomena that are occurring and become pessimistic about it. It's very easy to become pessimistic about, for instance, fake news and disinformation. It's very easy to become pessimistic about things like the spread of certain diseases. But when you look at when you look at history for longer periods of time, when you look at how we're changing paradigms, it becomes a little bit easier to become hopeful, and that hope is really, for me, what drives my optimism. It's not the technology instances that we come out with or how they're immediately adopted both by business or by the individual. It's how they're adopted over time and the paradigm that changes in the ways that we use technology and within our own public discourse over time. And I have just a few examples to kind of get us started and get the conversation started about that specific notion. So one of the first examples that I saw comes from biology. Over the last 10 years, many of you, I'm sure, in this room have heard about the notion of CRISPR. It's a gene editing technique, specifically CRISPR-Cas9, that basically allows you to take a look at the genetic code within a particular cell and cut and paste RNA or modify RNA/DNA within that cell in order to modify that cell's functions. And over the last 10 years, I've gotten very excited over some of the innovations that we've seen in CRISPR, some of its potential to cure things like Huntington's disease. As recently as a few days ago, several articles came out about how it actually cured several types of cancer within specific cells. They weren't actually able to do the trials on a specific human. And from that has spawned a paradigm of government, academia, and industry working at the interdisciplinary level, at a global level, to actually analyze genetic code and see what innovations can come from CRISPR. So biology, in many ways, is going to be, to the 21st century, what mechanical engineering, I would say, was to the 20th century. We're going to have both a larger understanding of biology coming from organizations like my own, NASA, where we're going to be looking at biology on different worlds, like Enceladus or Europa. As well as analyzing how Earth's impact on climate affects our own biology. We're going to get a better understanding of biology, and we'll have a better way to apply that biology. So that's one paradigm shift that I've started to see. Another that's closely related to that, and I'll start with the sort of instance of the technology, is some of you may have heard of the notion of golden rice. So in the last few years, this has taken a little bit of time to get approved, but in 2018, the FDA actually approved the use of golden rice. Now, world hunger was a significant problem in the 20th century, and some of that has carried over into the 21st century, despite us having technological solutions to this in the form of genetically modified organisms, where we can mass produce food by modifying it at the genetic level and provide the appropriate nutrients that are needed for that food. The technology wasn't really the problem in the space of GMOs. It was really more of a policy problem that controlled the dispersal of that technology at a global scale, and a problem with a lack of scientific literacy, which comes from a STEM education issue, and we can go down that road later. But when it comes to golden rice, the paradigm shift that I'm seeing is within the organizations that are funding the research behind golden rice, that are funding the deployment of golden rice, they've learned the lessons from not only the 20th century, but from centuries before that, in terms of how to deploy this mechanism to the people that need it. They're providing it to providing seeds to farmers essentially for free. Groups like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the World Bank, as well as many other organizations, have made it a point to say, we are going to provide this technology to the places that need it. Not necessarily, sort of the first world places like California and Oregon and places where there are still debates about GMOs, right? But to countries where it's truly needed and people are vitamin A deficient and things like that. So learning lessons about how to disperse and deploy technology in ways that immediately address the problem, and building up those pipelines and building a paradigm for building those pipelines is the second major one. And I'll finish with one that may be a little shocking as far as how I find optimism with this one, which is climate. So one of the things that I really saw over the last decade that really gave me hope, and once again my hope feeds optimism, was the Paris Climate Accords. This was in reality for the world being in the most democratized state that it's ever been in. Yes, we still have dictators, so on and so forth, but for it to be in the most democratized state that it's ever been in, we decided to get together and say that we are going to set criteria to address a global problem, one that requires us to work together, one that requires us to collaborate in ways that humanity has never done before. But it is at least a promise to do it. Now, it is imperfect. It doesn't set all the thresholds that I would like to see, but it is a first step. And really what it promotes is people, once again, operating at a global interdisciplinary level in order to take on the fundamental challenge of climate change. And you've already seen some of the effects of the Paris Accord, not necessarily from the technological level, but from the societal level. I mean, last year, those kids from Greta down to every child activist, based on both the promise that the Paris Accord gave, as well as all of the meetings that the IPCC have had, have gotten together and they're coordinating. The next generation is coordinating at a global level to really tackle this challenge. So once again, it's not the technology of CRISPR, it's not the technology of golden rice, it's not the Paris Agreement itself that makes me optimistic. It's the paradigm shifts that they are symbols of.
Thank you so much. I think that's a fascinating way to kick off the panel, especially to have the technologist on the panel respond with a policy answer. It almost makes us feel relevant. So I want to allow our other panelists to more quickly reply to that same question. What soon-to-come technological development, or in the vein of Dr. Campbell's answer, socio-technological development makes you most excited? We can go down the line if that's easiest.
Yeah. So thank you very much for having me here. As you may have heard, unless you've been under a rock, Verizon is deploying 5G. And so it will come as no surprise to anyone in this room that I find that incredibly exciting. And it's exciting for a couple of reasons. And it's not any specific application. It is the capabilities that this technology is going to bring to bear for innovators to experiment, to come up with use cases that we could never think of at Verizon. I mean, ultimately, you have to have advanced networks to be the foundation for all of the innovation that can spur from it. And so given that 5G is going to bring into existence faster speeds than we've seen in the past, extremely low latencies, the ability to connect a wide variety of devices, mobile edge computing, these are all inputs that are going to transform a variety of areas. I dare say there's probably no sector of the economy that will be untouched by it, whether you're talking manufacturing, healthcare, transportation, education, the list goes on and on. One of the things that we've done is, because we recognize that we're not the source of all good ideas, is we've created 5G innovation labs. And in those labs, we've invited innovators, folks with very cool ideas, to come in and experiment. It's an incubator facility, if you will, to come in and bring their ideas from concept into reality. And so what we've found is, and I think this is really going to be sort of the next phase of the digital economy, it's all about collaboration and partnerships. And what we found is these amazing ideas that folks have brought in. Let me just to pick up on the healthcare piece. I lost my mother a couple of years ago to cancer. She was diagnosed at a very late stage. Her tumor wasn't found until stage 4. We've partnered with an medical imaging company called Medivis, which does medical imaging, but has taken what has traditionally been a 2D experience with CT scans or MRI scans to allow surgeons to actually have a holographic 3D anatomical image that a surgeon, rather than just looking up on a monitor, which is 2D, to try to A, identify a tumor, or B, figure out the contours of it for surgery, to allow that surgeon to have a hologram that in the operating room is actually over the patient real time, to be able to really more precisely identify the contours of that tumor. That's one example. I mean, the folks at Medivis tell us that the applications for this in terms of training, educating medical providers are tremendous. The diagnostic piece of it is tremendous. And really what it's doing is it's taking AI, machine learning, and powering it with very low latency, really fast speeds to come up with this solution. And I'm not the technologist here, so that's my layperson's description of it.
That's pretty good.
The other area that I think we have seen that's really excited me is the possibility for new advances in assistive technologies for folks with disabilities. Often we talk about a lot of exciting advances, and the disability community is one I think that we can all relate to. Many of us, most of us, have someone in our families who have a disability or aging folks in our family. But one in particular that we discovered and we're partnering with is a company called Loro, and they have an AI-enabled assistive device for people with physical disabilities like ALS or MS, and it allows them to mount a device on their wheelchairs and to be able to direct that device to back up, for example, without running into objects, because it uses AI and machine learning to identify objects or impediments, like here's a curb, here's a bike, here's a dog. So it really will provide a lot more autonomy and independence and confidence for folks who have been traditionally quite limited and really unable to leave their homes without assistance. So those are just two examples, and I'll stop here, but I think that the opportunity for 5G to be a critical input into so many different use cases is one that really will help usher in the fourth industrial revolution.
Thank you so much. So just as a reminder to our remaining panelists in answering this question, let's try to keep it to a sentence or so.
He's like, she was too long, in other words.
Because I think we have several other questions I'd like to get to before we turn to
Sorry about that.
audience discussions at 10:15. No, I think it was excellent foundation for conversation later. So Alan Davidson.
What she said.
Excellent.
I'll just say there's a ton to feel, if you subscribe to Scientific American or Science News or Technology Review, there's a ton to feel optimistic about because there's so much progress being made in so many areas. We ticked off, bio, nano. I'm a big fan of what's happening in quantum. I think there's this kind of saying, we tend to overestimate the effect of these technologies in the short run and underestimate them in the long run being 10 or 15 years, and I think in 10 or 15 years we're going to see a lot in those spaces. The thing that most excites me is the application of a lot of things that are happening now into other spaces that are really going to make people's lives better, healthcare and disabilities. When we get to actually we've spent so much time building great AIs to serve people great ads, and when you start actually using some of those tools to do things that are going to improve human life in other ways, I think it's going to be super interesting. So that's my optimistic view of it.
Excellent. Andrew?
Yeah, so mine is machine learning and particularly the intersection of machine learning and advanced cryptography. There's at the beginning of the Obama administration, we had this saying, which was, the internet, it doesn't solve any problems, but it's part of the solution to every problem when we're trying to get policymakers to take us seriously. And I feel that way about machine learning now. It's part of the solution to everything from climate to health to economic growth and so forth. And it has many downsides that we will be talking about or challenges in the next couple of days, but it's incredibly promising in its ability to make sense out of this soup of information that surrounds us.
Hi, can you hear me? Is the mic working? Yeah, so I'm wearing two hats here, which puts me in a bit of a jam because I'm a science fiction writer, but I work for Sonos. So you'll hear me talk about both. So maybe just the Sonos hat is better at the moment. I think voice activation is a super interesting technology that some of you may like and some of you may hate. I think we're pretty optimistic that there are experiences with voice that can be very privacy friendly. So watch this space. And since this is a law school, Dr. Campbell, I'm going to come at you just a little bit because I was involved in the recovery from the 2010 Haiti earthquake, and one of the solutions, there was a lot of goodwill, people wanted to help out, but a couple of companies, which I think you probably know, well, I'll name it, Monsanto, wanted to donate rice to people in Haiti, and it actually well-intentioned, because there was a fear of hunger. But in fact, what Haitians would do, or some Haitians I should say, it's a big place, they would stockpile indigenous rice that they had cultivated over years that they knew were hardy enough to make it through the rainy season. And when the Monsanto rice arrived in sort of bucket loads, it was usable in the short term, but that rice needed to be, it couldn't be stored, and they had to buy more. So it felt like a dependency, and those types of grains and rices, it's great. And I think in the short term, but in terms of what we could learn from the golden rice sort of controversies would be thinking about that kind of situation. So building that as a policy solution that seems good on paper, experience is bad. In fact, Haitians were burning the rice. It was that bad in a moment where people were hungry. So just to illustrate that point.
I hear some pessimism slipping out.
Well, the optimism there is that if we learn from that, we tried it didn't work. If we learn from that, then
Then law can be optimistic.
But that gets to the point, right? Because one of the things that I highlighted with the golden rice specifically was the new paradigm that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have had for distributing that rice, as well as setting requirements on the people who create that rice, such that those dependencies don't exist. So it's not that the technology is the perfect solution; it's the paradigm that we set going forward. Yeah. And so that speaks to what you were saying, basically.
So my next question is to Andrew McLaughlin. We've heard a lot recently, and will likely hear a lot more today, about the ways in which information technology challenges democracy. What examples have we seen in the recent past of new media and new technology, in fact, bolstering democracy and its values?
Yeah, so this was a hard one to prep for. I'm not going to lie. Honestly, this required like some very serious thought over the last couple of days. But I do have something I want to put down as a marker for the panel and for the audience. So one of the great things about Silicon Flatirons, and the reason I've been coming back here for more than a decade now on a very regular basis, regardless of what my job is because it's a chance for old line policy people that came up in the 90s to keep meeting new generations of policy thinkers, and the Stepanovich era seems like it's going to be that in spades. So when I was coming up, and for the first kind of like the 90s and 2000s era, there was two great axes of conflict in internet policy. One axis was the surveillance privacy axis, and the other was the free speech censorship axis. These were the two great poles along which almost any policy question could be divided, understood, debated. What we've seen in recent years is that the platforms that came to life during that policy regime, or when that policy regime was sort of the dominant one, have become sort of these kind of like polluted cesspools that have brought upon us a toxic mix of unintended consequences from unrestrained business models and a sort of like an endless amount of wishful thinking that the humans on these platforms would always behave according to the most angelic elements of their natures. So what we've seen in the last decade has been the determined, a series of determined efforts to exploit these platforms, to engage in manipulation, propaganda, and systemically take the strengths of the various communications platforms that became dominant commercial players and turn them into instruments of the subversion of democracy. And so the question then is, from the perspective of democracy, what can we possibly look at that would give us some hope for the future right now? So the first thing that sort of leaps to mind, and I have just a couple of quick things that I'll throw out on the table for you all to chew on. The first thing that leaps to mind is that over the last year, fueled in large measure by communications platforms that are open and accessible to people at the ground level, we have seen an unprecedented global surge of social action out on the streets. India, Hong Kong, Bolivia, Lebanon, Chile, Ecuador, Argentina, Hong Kong, Iraq, the United Kingdom, earlier last year, Puerto Rico, Sudan, Algeria. It is not to be missed that people are still using these communications technologies to subvert repressive regimes, to protest against racist bigotry, including here in the United States. And I take some hope from that. On the axis of truth against propaganda, one of the things that I'm the most excited about as a kind of like fan person and internet activist is something called Bellingcat. If you haven't spent time studying Bellingcat, you should go check it out. It is essentially a voluntary collaborative of people who try to substantiate truth on the ground, whether it's the downing of a Malaysian airliner over the Ukraine and the assignment of responsibility to the specific Russian military unit that shot the rockets that brought it down, or massacres and human rights abuses in places as far-flung as Sudan and Bosnia. They use open source tools in public, working together to try to hold accountable the perpetrators of human rights abuses and the achievement of justice. It's very exciting, very promising. Another thing that I think I take some hope from is back in the late 90s, if you had asked whether the internet's core protocols would continue to be advanced through a vital and open community process known as the Internet Engineering Task Force, I would have said it's been a great run through the 80s and 90s, but the growth and scaling of the internet means that there's no way this organization could sustain itself. It'll get polluted by commercial interests and by companies trying to subvert its processes and so forth. And in fact, what we've seen is the IETF remain quite vital and remain quite impressive, despite all kinds of like headaches intrinsic in its operations, but I take a lot of hope from that. Another one that I take hope from is that we still see around us the ability of new platforms to rise. We are not stuck in, I don't know what it is, it's more than a duopoly now, but the Google, Facebook, Amazon, Twitter universe, new players can still come to life and reach scale. TikTok is, for whatever you may think about its anchoring in a Chinese ownership structure, it's an amazingly interesting, joyful, playful community or collection of sub-communities. And the fact that it has reached global scale very rapidly still gives me hope that this platform is not so controlled by the big communications companies that new players can't arise. So here's my final sort of note. One of the things that, and this is like a little bit of a selfie, I guess, but one of the things that my firm invested in political activism over the last couple of years is a company called Mobilize. And it's, I think mobilize.us is the current domain name. But what it is basically a matching service for people that want to volunteer for democratic and progressive campaigns to find volunteer opportunities around them with a ton of information. It is a very simple, very useful piece of the infrastructure of the left now. If you go to the Human Rights Campaign, or Sierra Club, or the DNC, or whatever, you'll find these buttons that say, click here to volunteer. It takes you to a single platform. You can look around you and see all the campaigns that have needs, and you can find a way to get involved. It sends you reminders. It asks you to review the experience afterwards. Anyway, all kinds of good little dynamics. And it is now powering, I think in the last election cycle, more than like, I don't know, something like 8 million volunteer shifts across the left side of the political world. It was great. It's awesome. It's using technology to get people more involved and make it easier, more frictionless, and so forth. So my final just note is, sadly and annoyingly, and in this area I think for sure, many of the problems that are caused by technology can really only be solved by the application of more technology. And if you're a science fiction person, I know some of you in the room are, there's this other future which the Dune books are sort of based on, where we have a Butlerian jihad of humans having to like crush the machines to reestablish the primacy of biological intelligence. But I think short of that, we're going to have to find ways to apply technology to solve the problems caused by technology. We can use machine learning in order to look at machine learning models to look for bias and toxic feedback loops, and we're going to have to. We're going to have to get good at that. I think the example of the automobile is a sort of like dire and kind of challenging one, but it does give you some hope for the future. Cars, when they came out and reached scale in the 1920s, caused staggering amounts of problems, unbelievable carnage and death on the roads. And what has made cars better? Not getting rid of cars, though maybe we'll get there someday, but the introduction of airbags, proximity detectors, cameras that allow you to see what's behind you when you back up. We're moving to electric motors, self-driving systems that may drive cars more quickly. I mean, the ugh part of this is that it took decades with incalculable environmental damage, violence to the fabric of our cities, an unbelievable scale of death across the world. But we're finally getting to a point where maybe we can realize the potential of the automobile without the downsides 80 years later. Of course, we have to do better when it comes to information technology, but I think we can.
And of course, the change in the automobile technology came in large part from class action lawsuits. Just return to the primacy of law, clearly.
Tort law to the rescue.
All right, so I want to allow, coming the other direction this time, so first Deji, then Alan, then Donna, and then Newton.
So this is the Optimism Panel.
You're trying so hard.
I would say this is the harder panel. This is the harder panel because of the work that we do. But I loved what Andrew said. What I'd love to hear is who's the Ralph Nader today of some of these technologies. Ralph Nader, who wrote Unsafe at Any Speed and helped bring about automobile safety. I think we're implicated as a company in the dominant platform conversation, but we think there's optimistically, we think there is time to act, and it's not too late. And as Andrew demonstrated, there's a possibility for innovative companies to make it. So hopefully we can reshape. I've been struck, one of the things that I'm most optimistic about, Zuckerberg's brilliance, you have to give him credit where credit is due, is that he understood the fundamental importance of human connection. And he went deep on that, and he had some great advisors, and you have to give him credit for that. But I think I'd love to see their killer app for tolerance. I think tolerance doesn't get its fair share. People think about diversity, and diversity, how important is diversity. Tolerance means you can live with people, but you don't have to like them. You have to tolerate them. I'd love to see the killer tolerance app, and I think there's room for that.
Super disturbed to hear I'm part of the old guard of internet policy. Thank you for that, Andrew. Glad to be here, though.
Tough but fair.
Yes,
You've been included in the Stepanovich era.
in the Stepanovich era, I celebrate that. So just to echo a couple points, I think, and I say this actually with a former government official hat on, also in the Obama administration, we are still engaged in this giant kind of global debate about open versus closed societies. And technology has actually played a major role, as Andrew kind of outlined really nicely, in, I think, in promoting the cause of openness. And yes, there are subversion. Yes, there is a question about whether this technology will continue to scale and help people be more open, or whether it will be used by the closed societies of our world to increase their grip on closedness. But I think there's a lot of reasons to believe that this is a force, that a lot of what we're building in information technology and the internet, it has been and will continue to be a force for openness. The other, I know it's hard to be on the Optimist panel. I think, part of the thing that's so deeply disturbing is that we do not really, it's quite clear now that we don't fully understand all the ramifications of what we're building. Does Facebook really understand what's happening on Facebook? I think there's a lot of reason to believe that they don't, and they didn't in 2016, and it goes to elections. I think we should worry deeply about what kind of control the major platforms have looking at 2020. Maybe the note of optimism here is that we've started to recognize we have a problem. It's the first step in the 12-step program. And I do think that's a little bit of a reason for hope, because we've got a lot of work to do to figure it out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think I would echo Andrew's point about political engagement. I'm a child of a civil rights activist. Father went to college in Atlanta in the early 60s, and he tells me they use mimeograph, ladies in the church use mimeograph machines to hand out flyers to let folks know about marches. The ability that these platforms have provided, technology has provided, number one, a heightened awareness of inequities in our society. There are lived experiences that certain members of our community have that many of us just weren't aware of. Frankly, it wasn't our experience. We may have been skeptical about the validity of claims of certain experiences. And so I think elevating those for the world to see so that we can examine them has been positive, and also, mobilizing people who, particularly in disadvantaged communities, vulnerable communities, who heretofore didn't have a voice. If it wasn't, embraced by a dominant society, it didn't exist. And I think these platforms have enabled a uncovering of what's really happening for all people in our society, and it forces us to grapple with it. I think that's positive.
So just kind of once again echoing Andrew's point, one of the things that I've seen is, yes, when you have a problem that is fundamentally regarding some technology or a mix of social behavior with technology, the response seems to be technology, right? You could think of it from a biological perspective, that if human beings get a negative stimulus, they come out with a technological response. And one of the things that I've seen is, for particularly short-term issues, we're very good at coming up with responses. The current disinformation campaigns that we're seeing and the current instantiation of disinformation campaigns, we are developing responses to those. A couple of examples are the DARPA Active Social Engineering Defense program, where we're actually taking a look at, okay, if you get targeted online, or if a specific group is coming after you online, here's how to not fall prey to the disinformation that's coming from that, as well as the DARPA computational simulation of online social behavior. That is a mouthful of a program title. They call it social sim, but this is actually taking a look at the social media paradigm at large scale and figuring out how to simulate how to simulate that entire environment such that we can inject points of disinformation in and see how that would propagate over time. Obviously, that could have some negative uses, but the idea is for us to easily be able to quell disinformation campaigns as soon as possible. A couple of other examples that I have from my own personal work, sort of outside of the NASA and DoD circles. One of the things that we've focused on is STEM education that unites both artificial intelligence as well as policy and politics. Getting both of those camps to really understand each other is better for the overall paradigm and better for the overall environment. One of the programs that I'm working on, for instance, is an education campaign where we're hosting hackathons for students to create a policy bot that could run for president, where we look at past decisions from previous policymakers and generate a reward function based on electability, right? Obviously an impossible thing to actually come up with a solution for, but it's educating people both on the policy side about some of the repercussions of artificial intelligence, how some of the analysis could be used, and it's educating people on the computer science and mathematics side about policy. Right. Another one is, and I was discussing this one prior to walking in here. We're looking at doing something as simple as taking FEC data, Federal Election Commission data, which has an open API that anybody in this room can access upon request. It's just the listings of who donates to a campaign. One of the hackathons that we're planning on hosting, and we need to find a new venue. Wink, wink, Colorado. Is a hackathon in which the students would be able to take a video of a candidate or elected official, use object detection neural networks to identify who that official is, use voice detection to identify the subjects that they're talking about, and then tie that back to the FEC data so you could overlay a candidate who, for instance, is talking about defense funding with the amount of money they're getting from Raytheon and SAIC and all of those things. So technology and the democratization of technology, both from the government perspective with government investments like the one at DARPA, as well as individual investments in education in both of these camps, I think is really what there is to look forward to in future years.
So I thought that he was initially highlighting the importance of lawyers, and now I'm realizing he's replacing us with AI. So in the interest,
you gave us a lot of training data. Sorry.
So in the interest of allowing us to have some time for questions, what I'm going to do for the next 3 questions to our panelists is just have the one person answer them, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience, and hopefully have around 5 minutes at the end for everybody to say their say. So the next question goes to Alan Davidson. In what ways might values be baked into the design of technology at the onset, such that technology serves values like privacy, fairness, or equality rather than harms them?
Excellent, thank you. And I should say I'm playing the part of Leah today for those who are confused in the program about why I'm here. So answering that question, I'll start by saying, lawmakers tend to treat technology as an inevitability, right? Like, it's hard to understand, where did it come from? Let's just think of it as a black box, and then we'll respond to it. Technologists know that there's actually a truth here, which is that there are many choices that get made when you're designing, building, deploying new tools, right? And the secret is we can actually affect those choices. We can make affirmative choices to protect things, human values that we think are important, privacy, inclusion, access, other kinds of values. It requires some intentionality, and that's a little bit of the rub, but we can do it if we have the will to do it. So companies, like the one I work for, Mozilla, make choices about values every day when they're building their products. And I could just say a little bit about what that looks like on the ground, right? So Mozilla, we make the Firefox web browser. For us, it starts, we have a manifesto. I know these things get mocked all the time. We are trying to make the world a better place. We actually have a mission and a manifesto, and it is to make the internet an open and public resource available to all. We translate that, and that manifesto actually has like 10 different parts about then what does that actually really mean, and privacy is part of it, inclusion is part of it. When we're going about building a web browser, we think about like, okay, how do we make those values real? So when you make a web browser, you have access to a lot of browser data. We choose as a company not to keep it. We have something we call our lean data practices, and we have access to a lot of information, but we choose in building our browser not to collect that information, not to keep it. We have a small set of things that we do keep when people opt in for it. We do have people who have accounts, and we very carefully work to make sure that we're securing their data in a way. And we have tried to hold ourselves out as the browser you can trust. We're more private, more secure than some of our competitors, and we'll see if that succeeds in the market. But the interesting thing also about this is, how do you make this real on the ground? We actually have a community of people, we call them our data stewards internally, whose job it is to go and work with the different product teams. And when people are thinking about doing something like collecting new data, they are charged with raising that issue and making sure we do some kind of risk assessment every time. And so it takes intentionality, it takes work, but you can do it. Another great example of how we do this in our practice is we're an open source company. That was a major choice for us. That's not, a little while ago that didn't seem like such a typical choice for companies. We feel like open source is all of our code is public, and that's a way for us to be more inclusive, for people to have greater access to the tools that we are building, and it's a choice, right? It's a values choice. The problem is, there are many examples out there, not just at Mozilla, right? You could look at, the choices that a lot of large companies is Street View blur faces? That was something Andrew and I worked on years ago together. Is my IoT device patchable? Does my AI train on biased data? Place after place after place, we can do the issue spotting. There are these choices being made by engineers, by technologists, by business people. And so the question is, how do we make sure we're making really good choices, or choices that are driven by values that we all think are important? I would say that, I'd like to say, that the market will do this itself, and that there'll be lots of companies out there like Mozilla that make these choices and feel like maybe they can win in the market by making good choices that people will really value. We have a little bit of a luxury. We're owned by a nonprofit. We're not out there trying to maximize our profit, and so we can make some of these choices and see how they work by doing things that we think are good, good for people. The truth is that we have seen in the market now, I would say I feel disappointed, right? That a lot of the companies run by well-intentioned people who really do feel like they're out trying to make the world a better place have made choices that really undermine some of these values that we think are important. Privacy, democracy, inclusion. And so we're going to have to really think with greater intention about how we make those values embedded and real, because we know we can do it. We can make those choices. A couple of things about how we're going to end up having to do it. One is about, and this is this is the hopeful part because there is a path here. One is companies themselves realizing that this is important, and we're seeing it more and more. There is a reaction out there. I think the large players globally who work in this space see the techlash and understand that they've got to do better. There's also a lot more sophistication developing in the frameworks that we all have for thinking about how do you do privacy-sensitive design, how do you do value-sensitive design, and so that's a bit of a cause for hope. A second is there's going to be a regulatory reaction, and as somebody was saying, with autos, it didn't just happen by itself, right? It wasn't that car makers decided to do all those things. There was regulation involved, and regulation has been, it's been the dirty word. We have basically spent the last 2 decades with a strong, kind of reason to believe that the market here would develop technologies that were ultimately really good for society, and there have been some really good reasons to believe that was true, and we're now at a point where we're going to need companies need some guardrails at the very least, some guidance, and that's the nice way of putting it. I think we're going to see a need, we're going to see, it's certainly in areas like privacy, we're seeing that we need to have that greater regulatory certainty. And the last thing I think is figuring out how we build capacity in our society to understand these values choices, and we've touched on it a little bit here. How do we create a cadre of technologists and engineers and builders who understand the implications of what they're building? How do we create a cadre of policy people who understand what it means to regulate in this space or understand the implications of technology? There are a lot of people working on different pieces of it. We're, for example, part of this great program that the Ford Foundation's put together called, they're trying to build the field of what they call public interest technologists, working with a lot of universities. I don't know if Colorado's part of it, it should be. To try and think about how you train this next generation of technologists to be sensitive to this. We also have to build capacity as a society in the public to think about these things in the choices that we make in the market. And those are, I think you're seeing the glimmer of that now, of trying to build that greater capacity, get more technologists in government, get a better educated public thinking about this. And that's going to be the path to ultimately building the better values in, because the companies can't do it themselves. They need guidance from all of us about what progress really looks like in technology, but we know we can do it.
And just to add the policy wonk addendum to that, the sometimes maligned in US circles General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union added a privacy by design, or really data protection by design and by default requirement to their massive data privacy law. And most of the US versions of privacy law that I've seen proposed leave that out. So it's kind of an interesting nexus for that debate. All right, so Amy, we're going 5 minutes over. I'm okay? Thank you. So to Donna Epps, this is the, I guess, institutional design version of that same question.
Yeah.
In what ways might values be baked into the design, not of a particular technology, but of a technology company, such that it is responsive to consumer needs, human rights concerns, et cetera?
Yeah. So it's really building on Alan's answer. I think as a company, you really have to create a culture that includes several things. First, it's bringing the outside in. And what that means is a listening culture. You have to develop trusted relationships with outside stakeholders who can tell you what you don't know. Companies, especially large companies, we have 140,000 employees, we can be very insular places. And it's imperative that you have trusted stakeholders who operate in the consumer, civil and human rights fields, disability fields, to really share with you what may be unintended consequences of the products and services that you release. And even if it's not unintended consequences, it may be ways just to improve and enhance a win-win for everyone. But if you do not have that sort of feedback loop, you're going to miss issues, there are going to be blind spots, and there are going to be things that are really just bad for business. And so I think that is, and I'm seeing that more and more, the importance of strategic alliances with partners who, frankly, are quite sophisticated about tech policy. I've been doing this almost 20 years, and almost every one of our leading public interest, civil and human rights stakeholders have dedicated tech policy personnel. And I think companies have to provide expertise to these organizations about technology and some of the realities about the building and the development of it. But companies have to listen as well about what's the lived experience of people who are impacted by these technologies. So that would be one. The other thing is I think companies have to build real civil and human rights capability and expertise within the organization. And those folks have to have, as their dedicated role, how you hear a lot of companies now giving voice to, we're going to be a responsible business. Well, what does that really mean day to day? And there has to be someone with some accountability. That's their dedicated role. These folks need to be embedded with the business folks, embedded with the product teams, so that they are there on the ground to be able to issue spot until we get our technologists trained, and the kudos to the programs that are doing that. But we have to marry them with professionals who have that lens to bring to bear. And those folks have to be senior enough to have the authority to sort of demand the accountability that's required to make real changes and to get senior leadership's attention to say, time out, there's a problem here. So that human rights sort of dedicated expertise, I think they are critical partners to any company that's involved in technology, and it can't be they're over here. This is in the this is what we say in our corporate social responsibility report. It has to be not separate from the business. It has to be the business. The other thing I would say is that the companies just have to be intentional about educating everyone in the organization, not just the lawyers or the policy people or that human rights expert. Everyone within the company has to have some knowledge, basic knowledge of the ethical concerns that are adjacent to the products and services that the company offers, because we need so many ambassadors out there who will be able to pinpoint or identify an issue that may be, different from what sort of the insular thinking is, basically because they, have a understanding of, wait a minute, this sort of doesn't smell right. I could go on, but I think those are some of the key tenets.
Excellent. And then I saved my favorite question for last, except for your questions, which may become my favorite question. For Deji, how do science fiction and other narratives of technological optimism positively influence the development of soon-to-come technology? And how should we be imagining our near future?
Great, thanks. Great questions. I think there has been a fair amount of scholarship on tracing science fiction to technological development, so I'll just say Google it. And I'll talk about the things that
Or DuckDuckGo
are in my lane. So I think so I want to make 3 points. The first one is that I think everyone has the right to imagine their own future. And that's sort of how I came to be a science fiction writer. So for folks who don't know, I wrote 2 novels. One is called Nigerians in Space. The second is called After the Flare. And they both feature protagonists of color who are scientists. Of African descent. You can see from my name I have Nigerian heritage. And part of that was I looked around and I didn't see books reflecting that. And while I wouldn't call my own writing hard science fiction, I do take a look and stare technology in the face and make it a part of the story. And if I'd known people like Dr. Campbell before, I think you would have been a character in the book. That's why it's great. That's why it's great to be at this conference and to meet new people. So and that gives you an opportunity when you can imagine your own future. What that does is when you're looking inwards, and if you think of something like depression, it's a turning inwards. Or if you think of oppression, you're forced to turn inwards. And imagining a better future for yourselves, and that includes technology, can be very powerful and liberating. You might not get there, but at least you're moving outside of your frame. The second point is that the tool, more practical tool to do that, is you might call science fiction thinking. I'm not sure if Kevin Bankston is here, but if you haven't read his stuff, he's now at Facebook, formerly at OTI, has done a lot of great work on connecting the dots between policy and science fiction and how authors have influenced over the years. And I think it's a powerful tool. So what does science fiction thinking mean? I'll just give an example, world building. World building is a tool that some people are familiar with now. And what that means is when you're in a fantasy or science fiction story, you are imagining the politics, you're imagining the weather, you're imagining the physics of the place, you're imagining what things taste like. One of my favorite things that I get to do each year is I'm a judge for a perfume contest. And why is that good? As a writer, if you're a writer, a fiction writer, scent is really important. Scent is really important for telling a story and for our lived experience. So there are actual genres that look at this. Cli-fi, which is climate science fiction. So there are a number of authors working in that space. Hope punk, which is another genre, and that is very optimistically focused. And then Afrofuturism, which is what I get lumped into, and that's people of color and African descent telling stories of agency. And if you want to, get involved right now and just start seeing what kind of writing is coming out, Carl Schroeder's in the audience and is part of Future Tense. It's a project between Arizona State University, Slate, and New America. They have a newsletter. Get on that newsletter. It's great. You'll get stories. You'll get things to go watch. They do movie screenings. If you're in DC, you can go check out some cool films and hear people like Francis Fukuyama talk about the apocalypse. And for me, practically speaking, I wrote 2 stories recently, one about algorithmic bias. And the idea was like, I imagine a future racket sport 200 years in the future, and the referee is artificial intelligence and can't help but be biased towards the richer, more powerful opponent because that's the way the code was written. Another one is about nanosatellites, and that was an MIT Tech Review. And that was just sort of the proliferation of satellites that are meant to connect people to the internet and serve other things, low Earth orbit, but has this kind of consequence of space debris. So you can look at things through science fiction and help us think about policy. In that story, I didn't think about what astronomers are now complaining about, which is the radio frequency jamming from these satellites, and then also the sort of visual pollution when they're conducting their studies of the sky, that the SpaceX satellites are getting in the way of their research. And the third thing, which I think Andrew mentioned, is democracy is a constantly renewing process. And while it was, the framers came up with it several hundred years ago, and that included a certain group of folks, every generation needs to invent it for themselves and imagine it for themselves. And I think science fiction thinking can really help with that. I think the idea of the sort of like heat exhaust port in the Death Star that you shoot like a little thing and the whole system breaks apart and everything's okay isn't always that, or if you want to use Tron, throwing a disk into the master control program. That's not necessarily, from a policy perspective, going to happen most of the time. They're great stories, and I'll admit I like those kinds of stories and I write those kind of stories, but that's maybe not the best use of this tool in terms of policy. So there are times where it's just not appropriate, where the harms are too evident and it's time to act and mobilize. And so I don't want to overstate the value of it, but it is a tool that can be very helpful and fun for people to use.
Thank you so much. So as is the tradition, we'll start with a student question, and then what I'm going to do is take 3 questions from the audience, lump them all together, and allow you all to respond in closing. So students, I know who you are.
Cold call. Do
I
it.
know.
Socratic method.
I'm looking at several of you who are in my classes.
Optimism's tough. It really
I know.
is.
Challenges. Why shouldn't we be optimistic?
Yeah. All right. So we'll open up to general audience questions. We'll have a conversation in my seminar later about why some of you didn't volunteer. Okay, Kelsey, you have a gentleman over here. So that's our first question.
Hi, my name is Al Saunier. You brought up the fake news and using AI to detect false data. I noticed, though, that you brought up the Defense Advanced Research and Project Agency both times for both initiatives to detect that. Are you optimistic, given things like posse comitatus, that we should be doing that type of research in the Defense Department, or does it belong someplace else?
It's a nice way to add the word optimism to a non-optimistic
Yes.
question. All right, so I have Brad and this gentleman who is sitting on the side there.
Okay. Should I?
No, we'll have two more
okay.
questions. Please.
Gotcha.
Thank you. Alan, I was really interested to hear about how Mozilla goes about infusing values into the products that it creates. I'm wondering whether you or other panelists have a belief about which of those values might be generalizable, that if you are building a platform, period, here are the values that should be core to the platform, irrespective of the type of platform that you're building.
And then the last question, I believe, was right. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Johannes Bauer from Michigan State University. I want to make it short. I had actually a long question, but in the interest of time. So we've been knowing this for 200 years, that any entrepreneurship, any good working market needs a legal regulatory framework, right, to function well, right? And so how, at a time when politics has become in many ways so dysfunctional, how do you imagine that division of labor should work like between the entrepreneurial side and the public policy side?
Great. So let's just go down the line. I think, Dr. Campbell, if you want to start, since you had one directed towards you.
Sure. So the question was, they're basically defense. Both of the first initiatives that I talked about were defense related, and how am I optimistic given that they are both defense, and we could use those things for positive or negative reasons. I would say that for many other organizations, I would be a little bit more worried if that were coming out of, let's say, the naval research, or out of one of the intelligence agencies. Although I very much support a lot of the research that they do, but the organization that I mentioned specifically sort of has a long historic past of creating technologies that, yes, it has a D for defense in its name, but those technologies have been sent off to every other sector of the economy. I mean, DARPA I look at as NASA's older, angrier cousin. They were both birthed out of the Sputnik era. For those who don't know, back in '58, Russians put an empty-out missile silo above our head. U.S. government freaked out. They created ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency. A year later, they created NASA. Right? Both really tasked with beating the Soviets. But the job of DARPA is to make sure that the United States is never technologically surprised again. And if I would worry about it in the context of these two programs, I would have been worried about it in the context of them building the predecessor to the internet, them building the predecessors to GPS, Siri, and all of these technologies that they then piped out to the rest of the world. And I think it speaks to a larger problem of, yes, when inventing some of these new technologies to address current technological problems, there's always a positive and negative. There's always a way that a technology, even if you have people come in and say, oh, it could be used in all of these ways, I can find a million ways to use a technology in a terrible way. I used to work in cybersecurity. So, so there's always going to be a method of taking a technology and using it for ill means, but education on behalf of the populace, the more scientists and engineers that we can generate that are doing other things, the more solutions that we can come up with that use those technologies in a more positive light and that can handle and address those problems down the line. I think it's more of a never-ending game. I don't think we get to a point of where we've invented all the appropriate technology that will ever need and that can never be used in a harmful way. People who, like I said, think like me won't allow that to happen, unfortunately. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think I'll respond to the question about the division of labor between entrepreneurs and public policy. And I think this. I think there is a role for government, right? We were in what was a nascent era of next wave of the digital economy, and now it's not so nascent, it's matured, and we realize that there are some issues and some concerns. And so I think there is a role for government to set out some, as Alan said, guardrails, some frameworks, some expectations, some principles. And I think one of the things we've seen in the last year or so is many large companies actually saying that yes, we could use some help, some guidance here. And so I think that's where we are now. It's going to be very complex because no one wants to get this wrong and damage a real bright spot in our economy. But we do need to have some policy frameworks to help guide the entrepreneurs, the innovators. I don't think it's fair to expect them to be able to, particularly because, let's face it, there is self-interest in our free market system. So I think that there very much has to be a collaboration, a partnership, a synergy between the innovation and policies. The question really is, they have to be smart policies. What are those policies so that we can continue to have the balance that I think has been the age-old balance of increasing innovation and all of the benefits that flow from it with protecting the social compact that we all hold so dear.
Can I just chime in there? And I would say, putting on my other hat, uncertainty there is really a killer. So, I think one thing we've noticed with some of the, with GDPR and CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, is when something is vague, it actually is very, it can really harm innovators trying to do the right thing. Even people who want to act in good faith, and if there isn't a dialogue and ready availability to clarify those things, it's actually really, people lose money and time. I personally lose sleep over that. I actually do. So I think that's just another little qualification that it can't be lazy, somehow keeping that dialogue and keeping those channels open so that after the policy and regulations come out, and I heard on the radio once, like, if you try replacing the word regulation with protections, and suddenly you can get in a different frame of mind that these are rules meant to protect, consumers and innovators in the economy.
Yeah.
On the question of the sort of, are there more generalizable frameworks out there? It's a great question, and there are, and I think there are a lot of people who've been working on this. I mean, even at Mozilla, I just mentioned 2 areas, privacy and accessibility, open source, that we talk about. We have this manifesto. I laugh when I say it because it is kind of funny, but it's got 10 parts, and we slave over the words in each one of them, and they go to a lot of different values that we use. There are a lot of different frameworks out there. We talked about GDPR now, incentivizing the use of privacy protective frameworks internally and privacy assessments. We recently had a fellow at Mozilla who did a study on all the AI frameworks that are being developed, kind of AI assessments. There are, I think, looking over at Rick, I think there's like over 90 of them now that different governments and different NGOs have developed. So there's a lot of activity in this, and so there are a lot of models out there, which I think is the good news. The hard part is going to be this messiness of now bringing these political values. In some ways, this is a question like we grapple with as societies. What is forward progress? What are we seeking in the things that we build? So defining progress is not. There's no one answer. I will just say very quickly on the DARPA question. To me, another view of this is back to this capacity issue. We have invested a ton in the capacities in our defense and national security arena in the U.S. in ways that we have not, and the civilian capacities have not really kept up. And so I think one place we really need to be thinking a lot more about investment is in our ability to deal with the consequences of these technologies and analyze them in the way that DARPA does so well. And there's been a lot of work there. There are a lot of other governments outside the U.S. who are doing this maybe better than we are too, which I know is heresy sometimes, but a lot of the best thinking is probably going to come out from out there. And the thing that's most worrisome to me about this, internet was supposed to be the easy one, honestly, right? Like 20 years ago when I got into space, I thought we were going to figure out the internet rules, and then we'd move on to the hard ones like CRISPR, and genetics, climate change, the environment. That stuff is going to be really hard. Yeah. And so if we can't get this one right.
Optimism.
Sorry. There's a lot. Okay. So I think there's ways to get it right. Yeah. Andrew, tell us how.
Nice ad. I have been officially informed that we are at time and that the audience needs a break before the next panel. That said, Andrew, you've got a sentence and Dej.
Oh, fine. So a generalizable principle that strikes that balance is the following syllogism. We know about the unintended consequences of regulation. As Americans, we feel this deeply. We have to apply that same thinking to the unintended consequences of technology and products. Assume the worst. Build for the best to thrive regardless. Assume a systematic, sustained effort to advance propaganda and achieve manipulation, destabilization, and rancor in our society. And if you can build your product to thrive regardless, you will have done the right thing.
No further comments.
Thank you all.